Hey guys, welcome back to another video. In this one, we're talking about everything you need to know about adapting vintage lenses to modern cameras. We'll talk about lens mounts and types, what works, what doesn't, adapters, all the features you need to know about when picking out an adapter, and then I'll give you some recommendations for modding and buying lenses. This video is not sponsored, but it is supported by those of you who have purchased my camera guides and LUTs. To learn more, check out the information in the description. Let's go ahead and get started by talking about the 3 things you need to consider when adapting lenses to your camera. The first is going to be flange distance. This is the distance between the lens mount and the camera's lens mount. A good rule of thumb is that the system you want to adapt should have a longer flange distance than the camera system that you're using. For example, the Nikon F mount flange distance is longer than the Canon EF flange distance. Therefore, you can use Nikon F lenses on Canon EF cameras. If this isn't the case, you can sometimes still adapt a lens to that camera, but there will be a corrective optical element in the adapter, and that is going to massively reduce quality. For example, if you wanted to adapt a Canon FD lens to a Canon EF lens, you're going to have to use one of those adapters and the quality is terrible, so I just wouldn't recommend going there. The second important factor to keep in mind when you want to adapt a lens is to understand if it's even physically possible. Sometimes, even if the flange distances work out, it's just not possible to adapt a lens. For example, here's a really cool vintage 35mm lens, and while I'd love to be able to use this and the mount technically would work, there's this huge rear glass element on this thing that would stick pretty far into my sensor area of my camera and most likely would hit the sensor or hit a mirror of a camera or something like that. So I just can't use this lens as originally intended, which is too bad. So if you find a lens that you'd like to adapt, go ahead and do a search and see if there are adapters available or if there's any forums with people talking about how it's impossible. And our third thing to keep in mind when you want to adapt a lens is to understand sensor or image coverage. All of these lenses are designed to cover a certain film size or sensor size. For example, this absolutely microscopic Pentax Auto 110 lens will not cover full frame. Somehow it covers Super 35, which is incredible, but this is not going to work well if you're using a full frame camera. If you want to learn about these crazy little lenses, I've done a video on that, so check it out in the description. Now let's dive into talking about adapters for your lenses and some of the features you should consider. And the first thing I would think about if I were picking up adapters is whether or not they are active or passive. So a passive adapter is what you see here. It's a piece of metal that will adapt a lens to your camera. There's no electronics here. It's just a piece of metal or sometimes plastic that'll convert things for you. An active adapter has electronics, and if you're using a lens that has autofocus or other features like that, the adapter will take that information and let your camera control the lens, which is great. Obviously, for older vintage lenses, this isn't something you really need. However, there are sometimes adapters that have focus confirmation, and in short, when you use this with some cameras, you'll have focus confirmation or a little box or dot letting you know that your image is indeed in focus. So if you shoot a lot of stills, that can be a feature that's really handy to have in an adapter. The next feature you might want to consider in a lens adapter is what's called a focal reducer, or in the case of Metabones, a speed booster. Here I have one mounted to my GH5, and as you can see, there's a glass element. In short, this is going to give you a wider field of view and give you an extra stop of light, and it'll kind of fake your camera system into having a larger sensor. So if you shoot on Micro Four Thirds or Super 35 and you want to use a full frame lens or 35mm film lens, you can do that with a focal reducer. There are really nice ones like this Metabones adapter, which works great, but there are also more affordable options from other brands on eBay and Amazon that I'll link to in the description along with everything else we're talking about. Another feature you might want to consider, especially when you have a lens with a screw mount. For example, this lens has an M42 screw mount, so it's a thread. There's no bayonet or anything. You literally screw it onto your camera, or in this case, an adapter. This adapter is a great thing to consider because it has a rotating ring. So the reason you have this is if I thread this adapter onto this lens, you might have the focus marking upside down where they're facing the ground. So when you look down at your lens, you don't see any information. That's not very helpful. With this adapter, there's a little screw that you can loosen and then rotate the adapter, keep everything tight, but be able to reorient the lens so that you can read all of the markings. So something like that is really important when dealing with a screw mount lens. Another awesome feature on some adapters is a positive locking system. So if you think of Canon EF, usually you stick the lens in, you rotate it, and it clicks into place. But with a lot of these adapters and stuff, there's a little bit of play. So some adapters have a positive locking ring like these models from Metabones. They're much more expensive, but you stick the lens in there and you rotate a collar and it'll lock down on the lens and it'll be a lot more secure than just having a traditional setup. So if you're going to be adapting a ton of lenses to one particular mount, that might be something you want to think about. Another feature to consider on lens adapters is filters. There's a lot of adapters these days that have magnetic little drop-in filters or a thread on the back where you can thread on an adapter, or something like this, which is a fader ND built into an adapter. So as I rotate this ring, it'll brighten up. You can kind of see right through it, or I spin it the other direction and it's going to darken the image. There is a built-in fader ND inside of this adapter. So some cool stuff out there these days and something you might want to consider when adapting some lenses to some cameras. Another feature that a lot of adapters have is some kind of mounting point, and it's great when you're using a camera for video and you already have a cage. Often there's a little accessory you can buy that'll thread directly into your lens adapter. This means I could then bolt the lens adapter down to my rig, and now that thing is rock solid. There's going to be no play, no wiggle, and it's a really nice feature to have, and they're only on some adapters. When it comes to brands to consider for adapters, there are so many these days, I really can't get into them all. I will say that Metabones has so far, for me personally, been one of the best, and there are other ones that I'll put on screen here that I like for various reasons or I've heard really good things about. But the tricky thing with adapters is one brand might have one of the best EF to micro four thirds adapters, but then the rest of theirs are terrible. So do some research, read reviews, but in general, if you're spending a little more money, you're going to be getting a nicer adapter. And don't be afraid of cheap adapters. If you're just going to mess around with one or two vintage lenses for stills, feel free to buy a couple affordable adapters that are a couple bucks on Amazon or eBay, and that'll be a great way to get into this hobby or this crazy addiction, depending how you look at it, and something that I do quite often, honestly. Next, let's talk about a method of adapting lenses that is a really good idea if you're going to buy several lenses or build different sets, and that is double adapting or doubling your adapters. For example, here I have a GH5 just for reference, and I've added a Metabones Speedbooster, and that essentially turns this camera into an EF mount camera. So at this point, you can just pretend this is a part of the camera, then adapt all of your lenses to EF. What this means is you don't have to buy really expensive adapters for every single lens, and you can just convert everything to EF. And now you only need to buy one micro four thirds to EF adapter, and all your lenses will work on it. Down the road, if you decide to buy a Sony camera, which has an E mount, you could then just go out and get a single EF to E mount and all of your lenses will adapt. So that's how I go about adapting my lenses. If at all possible, I convert them to EF. From there, I get one EF adapter per camera mount, and I'm good to go. Before we get to lens recommendations, I want to talk about modding lenses. So far we've talked about, adapters. You throw them on the back of the lens, now that lens adapts to something else. There is another option, and that is to permanently or semi-permanently modify the lens to have a different mount. There are a ton of great services online to do this. I'll have a few listed here and in the description. And essentially you can send these people your lenses and they can permanently or semi-permanently mod the lens to have a different mount. And finally, let's get into actual lenses I would recommend for adapting. We're going to talk about different kind of lens sets or lens mounts to consider, but I want to start by giving you a couple recommendations for your first lens to adapt. One that's very popular because it's really wild is the Helios 44-2. There are so many of these things on eBay, so it should be very easy to find one. You even have a ton of options with different finishes. For example, here is kind of a crazy chrome version of a 44-2. Here's two more with completely different body design. So there's just a lot of these things online, and it's a great lens to get because it has this crazy bokeh effect and it kind of swirls your bokeh or the backgrounds of your images. So that's a good one to go with. Another one I would recommend is a Canon FD 50mm f1.8. These are pretty affordable, and I really love Canon FD lenses. They're very warm in color and just a fantastic lens. They're not going to break the bank. Love them. Another option is a lens I just talked about in my filmmaking gear under $50 video, which you can check out in the description. And essentially this guy is a Olympus 50mm f1.8. I really love this lens. It's a really pretty lens when it comes to the design and the body, but it also has fantastic optics and a great one to consider. Finally, I would recommend getting pretty much any lens that has an M42 mount. The M42 mount is fantastic because it's so simple. It's just a thread on and off lens mount. So you can get a simple adapter and simply thread it onto the back of the lens. There are a ton of lenses that use this mount on eBay, and almost all of them are going to work on full frame as well as smaller sensors. So it's a really solid way to go. That's a fantastic way to start finding good lenses. And last but not least, when it comes to lens lines, there are several to consider. Some very popular ones include the Nikon F mount, which adapts to pretty much any camera on the planet. You can get really old 1960s versions of these lenses or more modern 80s era options, and they're fantastic Japanese optics, some of the best in the world. Also from Japan, we have the Canon FD lenses. These are stunning lenses. There are several versions, really old. These are the newer models, just great optics. Again, from Canon, Japan, good stuff. We already talked about M42 lenses. There are a ton of different manufacturers that use these back in the day. There are a ton of Russian and Ukrainian options, and one of the most prominent is going to be the Carl Zeiss Jenna lenses. You could read about the history, but that's a great one to look into. Those usually have an M42 mount. Another great mount to consider when it comes to vintage lenses is the L39 or M39. There are a gazillion different options from Zeiss Jenna, Helios, and a bunch of others. So you can definitely check those out. Just search for L39 or M39 lenses on eBay and you'll find a lot of stuff. And the list goes on and on. There are Olympus OM lenses, Leica R lenses, and a fantastic way to just keep diving into this crazy world is to go to a website called allphotolenses.com, I believe. There you can search by mount and find some wild stuff and just go off into the weeds, finding different sets of lenses, learning about their history. It's just a fantastic website to kind of start figuring this stuff out. So that's going to wrap up this video on lenses. Stay tuned for more lens content here on the channel. Going to be talking about a lot of vintage and new lenses and optics. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.